Hello, and welcome as we come now to the 17th week of the year. Let me begin by giving the readings for this time. The first comes from the second book of Kings, from chapter 4, verses 42 through 44, from the letter of Paul to the Ephesians, again chapter 4, verses 1 through 6, and from the Gospel of John, chapter 6, verses 1 through 15. Now, up to this time, we have been, as our gospel guide, has been that of Mark. As we have mentioned earlier, perhaps in our series here, because of the shortness of Mark's gospel, and in order to fill in the 34 ordinary Sundays of the year, it becomes important to find some sections that will fill in, if one wants, for John and for Mark. And it's with that in mind that for the next 6 weeks, beginning this time, the gospel selection will come from the 6th chapter of John. Now, remember that in our discussions here, we're really looking not only at the kind of readings that are being offered for a given weekend, but also a little bit of the background for the particular Gospels. We certainly have looked at the Gospel of John before. We have seen many of the characteristics that are unique to this Gospel. So I thought maybe to begin, I might give just a general outline of the 6th chapter of John. Now, keep in mind that these chapters were developed over a period of time, dividing verses into chapters, etc. But the 6th chapter has frequently been understood as dealing with the Eucharist, dealing with Jesus, and we will see under the imagery of he being the bread of life, the source of everlasting life, etc. So, first of all, just kind of, now I know you're going to run home and kind of look all this up, but just to give you a little bit of understanding of how we're taking the 6th chapter of John and working with it for the next, as I mentioned, next few weeks. So, here it is. First, verses 1, keep in mind we're in chapter 6, 1 through 15, have to do with a miracle, and that's what we will be talking about this time, and that will be the selection for our consideration in the gospel. Then verses 16 through 21 picture Jesus as walking on the waters, crossing the sea. Then verses 22 through 25 will find Jesus coming to Capernaum, to the place where he seems to have centered, you remember, his mission. This will be followed by verses 26 through 34, in which Jesus engages in a dialogue with the crowd. This is followed in verses 35 through 50, and here we get a discourse about Jesus as the bread of life. And then this will be followed by verses 51 through 58, and sometimes they include 59 here, in which there is another discord on Jesus as the bread of life. Then verses 60 through 66 is a dialogue that Jesus will have with his disciples. And finally, it's divided into 8 parts, so the 8th part, therefore, verses 67 through 71, will be a dialogue that Jesus has uniquely with the 12. All right, so I give that breakdown, and a number of those sections, obviously, if there are 5 more weeks after this, will also entail a discussion of some of those sections that we've looked at. But I wanted to give a kind of overview to begin with of how this 6th chapter has traditionally been divided and some of the discussions and aspects of it that take place. One will remember that there are a number of important themes that the Gospel of John, the 4th Gospel, has, And one of them is the theme of replacement, namely that Jesus replaces something which has been part of the tradition in the past. And what is characteristic in this 6th chapter is that Jesus replaces an event that is essential to Israel's history. In this case, Jesus replaces the feast of Passover. Now, notice as the reading will begin this time that when Jesus is assembled with his disciples, mention is made that the Passover is near. See, so right away we get this connection. Also, we will see that connected with the events that are part of the Passover is Moses and Moses' leadership, Moses' direction. Well, who is replacing him, if not Jesus also? So I just put that as a little bit of an understanding of a background. This replacement idea works in many ways throughout the 6th chapter, and it's much more subtle, the assumption always being that those who are listening to this passage have a familiarity with Judaism, with the tradition of Israel. All right, so what is the story that we are looking at this time? Is the fact that the choice here was kind of introduced by last time looking at Mark, who kind of leads us to this point. And Mark has his own version of this, namely the picture of Jesus feeding a large number of people. Now, scholars recognize that John, that is the 4th gospel, did not copy from the synoptics. So there are certain details that are unique to the story here that is recorded that are not found in the synoptics. In other words, Matthew, Mark, and Luke follow a traditional pattern with one another. So one of the questions that is raised here is the Passover is near. Well, didn't they already go up to the Passover to celebrate it? And this leads to what some suppose, because after all, for the Passover, Jesus should have been up there, should have been in celebrating like a good Hebrew believer, the occasion that brought the Israelites to this place of remembrance. So how come he's not there and he's drawing other people away? Leads to a thought that in the Galilee there was a second observance of the Passover. Now, it is possible that such a kind of situation was celebrated, and therefore it would have been celebrated with the traditional festival observances that went on up at Jerusalem, but here in a little different way. So whether or not that was the case or not is just a supposition that is presented by some who look at this passage in order to explain why Jesus himself would not have gone up to the Passover and why he was drawing a rather large group away from carrying on, which was the traditional practice of the Israelites at the time. So they are gathered, and there is a large number. Jesus has been pictured as teaching, a large number of people who are gathered. And as this story goes, and maybe just to, because I mentioned this, point out some differences in the Johannine version from that of the synoptics, is that first of all here, the disciples initiate the issue. This large crowd is gathered. Now I'm talking about the synoptics. And they say, look, there are a lot of people, Jesus. Why don't you send them home to the various villages and towns so that they can get something to eat? So by this, they initiate an action which Jesus then follows through with. However, in this gospel, it is Jesus who takes the initiative. And he says to one of his disciples, namely Philip, how are we going to get enough food to feed all of these people? Now, why does he pick on Philip, which some suggest? Well, Philip came from Bethsaida, which you remember is on the northern shore of the Sea of Galilee. It was, even the very title of the place means a fishing village. And so he would be, from a practical point of view, most familiar with the local customs. So when he says to Philip, how are we going to get enough food to feed this large group, that may well be why Phil is chosen for this task. Now, this is followed by the fact that another one of Jesus' disciples, Andrew, mentions that there's a little boy here who has 5 barley loaves and 2 fish, and suggests, well, how are we going to, is this going to be enough to take care of things? So now there are a number of other questions, certainly issues that one might look at. First of all, notice that what is mentioned is that they are barley loaves. Now, do you care whether they are barley or wheat? Well, yes, because wheat would have been the way in which those who were rather well-to-do or had the necessary means of life would have baked their particular bread. The poor would have used barley grain, which was a lesser, from one point of view, cheaper, that is, kind of grain. And so the fact even that the barley loaves are what are presented is a little bit of a hint as to the background here. And of course, the fish are mentioned. Barley loaves, therefore, the common grain. And we also know that if you're into agriculture, that the barley crop ripens more quickly. So if you are in a hurry to get something to eat, well, that might have been also behind the scene. I don't know, I just mentioned all these little incidentals that people have noticed about what is taking place. It is also interesting that the Passover was the time of the barley harvest. So there is a connection here. Now, fish, the kind of fish that would have been presented, certainly would have been cooked fish. They wouldn't have been, or baked, they would not have been fresh from the sea. The kind of ways in which, if you're interested in all this, those in this season now, as the canning season will soon be developing, will find that fish were cured, pickled, salted, and dried, and that there was a certain process by which the fish were preserved and able also not only to be eaten by everyone, but also perhaps to be sold in the marketplace. So the bread and fish are presented to Jesus. Now, in this gospel, and here's the second way in which this gospel differs from the synoptics, Jesus blesses, breaks the loaves, and in the synoptics gives them to the disciples to take to the crowd who is seated there, who you remember had been asked to be seated in little community groups. In this gospel, it is Jesus who takes the bread and feeds the people. So rather than using the disciples in the mission of, and you can imagine this is a large number of people, Jesus is pictured as feeding everyone. Now, if you take this literally, perhaps we miss the importance, but what is important is that Jesus is the one who is providing for the bread and the food, rather, for the people. Now, why are there 5 loaves? Does it matter? Well, go back now to what I mentioned earlier on about the replacement idea. In Israel, what are the 5 most important pillars upon which the faith is traditioned, if not the Torah? So the Torah is the law, the rule, the guide by which Israel is led and supported. So 5 loaves, the 5 books of the Pentateuch. You remember, namely Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy. So is that a replacement idea? So somehow or sometimes this metaphor may get a little bit more stretched, but nevertheless, just to kind of mention all of this. All right. So, and then of course there are the loaves who are left over, and there are more left over than had begun the process. So, a familiar story, and it is the initiating story in the 6th chapter of John, but it is this week, of course, that we will reflect on the uniqueness, if you want, of the Johannine position. Keep in mind, too, that the mention of the Passover had, as I alluded to before, mentioned Moses and the Exodus. Namely, Moses had led the Israelites out of the bondage of Egypt, and we're now in the wilderness, and that in a minute will bring us to the choice for the first reading this time. But here, if in the wilderness Moses is responsible for providing food for the Israelites, well, and we'll see it isn't Moses, but it's God, but nevertheless, the ages of Moses. In this gospel, Jesus replaces Moses, and he gives life, support himself. So, and the fact, as this had begun, I probably should have started with this, that Jesus had withdrawn to a mountain for this whole story to happen. Well, where did Moses get the Torah, if not on the Mount of Sinai? So if I'm trying to kind of make a point today in some of our reflection, it's this replacement theme and how it has really worked in this story. The first reading comes from the second book of Kings, which has to do with a story connected with Elisha. Now you remember that Elisha was the successor to the great prophet Elijah. And in the Old Testament, the 2 most active prophets, more for action than for what they wrote, were Elijah and Elisha. Now, let me give you a little bit of background here, that in this story, if you're familiar with how things work, first of all, there is often a pattern in how the episodes that are described in 2 Kings take place. There is a problem, there is a tension, and there is a solution. What we will see, and we'll analyze this a little bit, but let me just give the conclusion. The problem in this episode is famine, 100 hungry men. What's the tension? An unnamed man brings 20 barley loaves. There's that barley idea again. And the first fruits from his orchard. The solution is that because of the generosity of this man, all of the 100 are fed. All right, so that's the pattern. Now, this story is the third of 4 stories that are connected with Elisha's ability to kind of act as the prophet for Israel. The first has to do with a poor widow who is credited with having children. What happens is Elisha comes by this woman. The famine has taken place he comes, and this is Elisha, the prophet, asks, "What shall I do for you? Tell me." He says, what do you have in the house? Well, she says, "I don't have anybody, much of anything. We're running out of food. All I have left is this jar of oil. When I make the little cake with it, my sons and I will eat it and we will die." "Well," says the prophet, "look, give me something to drink, okay? And by the way, will you make me something to eat?" And so she does. And then he says, when it is brought to him, this food and drink, "Bring all of the vessels that you can find in your house, and collect in I don't know, in your house or in your neighborhood. Bring them all out, okay? And then shut the door of your house once you get them all in there, and then take the little oil that is left and start pouring it into each of those containers." And miracle of miracles, of course, as she continues to pour, there continues to be oil until all of the vessels that she has gathered are filled. Elisha then says to the widow, "All right, take the oil that you don't need, pay the debts that you owe. You and your children can live here for the rest of the time that this famine happens, and all will be well." So it's a kind of interesting story, is it not, where the poor widow will survive, have enough supply and enough income to take care of her and her children. So this is the first Elisha episode. I don't think there's any immediate connection with our reading this time, but the multiplication of the oil might remind one of the multiplication, if that's the right word, or the ever-increasing amount of oil that she receives. The second episode has to do with a Shemanite. Elisha often works, by the way, with his a servant named Gehazi, Gahaza. I think that's how you say it. She becomes very kind when now the background for this is that she had, and she was a rather wealthy woman, had provided an upstairs room for Elisha to live in or dwell when he was passing through. So she shows her generosity to the prophet. This is found in verse 37 of remember that the verses we're looking at here are part of 2 Kings. So, he says to her, because of her generosity, "I promise you that you will have a son." So as is often the case in these situations, a couple were childless and they wanted to hope for a child. Now, she doesn't ask for the child, but it is something that Elisha says she will have. So, all right, the child is born. But as this episode unfolds, we're not sure what the age of the child was. He wasn't a baby. But he while he's out working one day, comes in, dies. And she, that is the widow, now sends word to Elisha via his servant, who, and Elisha is at Mount Carmel, which of course we've seen as an important place in the stories of Elijah and Elisha, and kind of argues, "Why did you do this to me? I didn't ask for this child. Now the child is dead." Elisha says to his servant, "Go back to the house, put the child on the bed, lay my staff across it, and breathe on it." Doesn't work, okay? So to make a long story short, Elisha comes himself, goes up to the room, lays on the child, breathes on him mouth to mouth, eyes to eyes. The child sneezes 7 times and comes back to life. So that's the second episode. The third episode is the one we're looking at this time, where the situation, as we mentioned, they bring to him 100 hungry men. All of these apparently were companions of Elisha. What are we going to do? This unnamed man brings 20 barley loaves and the first fruits of the orchard. And what happens is that as they are being distributed, you can kind of see the connection of this story with the gospel today. Not the 20 loaves provide enough food to feed all 100 men. So isn't that a wonderful gesture? And there are other, and again, all this happens when there is famine. And I suppose the choice of this reading, as I may have mentioned on other occasions, if Elisha can feed 100 with 20, Jesus can feed 3,000 with 5 and a couple of fish. So talk about anything that the prophet can do, Jesus can do better. So that's the third story. And the fourth story concerns those who, and again, notice that the prophet often deals with those who live on the margins. That is, those who are economically, socially, politically vulnerable, and therefore are left defenseless, deserted, and hungry. So the prophet always acts on behalf of those who are in need. Well, isn't this a fitting conclusion, as Jesus also here feeds those who are hungry with bread, okay? So as we have seen, we find, by the way, that in the readings that take place in the synagogue, there is a 3-year cycle, and if there are 150 psalms, then one psalm is used each time that the community gathers. Now that's a little bit of background. That's not quite as obvious in this story, but it is perhaps interesting to see how the synagogue practice is also woven into the fourth gospel tradition. We will see more of this as we go along. And finally, keep in mind that in the Exodus story later on, that they are fed by bread, manna, and quail. Now we have not spoken a lot about this this time, but in the past we have. The quail, of course, were a kind of, bird that flew in from Europe because they got tired as they were coming. They often dropped down in either shores on Egypt or in the Palestinian area, which would indicate the place where these events were taken place in the story of Moses. So all of that is to say, once again, we are going to reflect this time on Jesus feeding. There's no mention here yet about the importance of this, but certainly Jesus feeds those who are hungry. This, of course, was the concern of the great prophets Elijah and Elisha, to make sure that the hungry and those in need were fed. And as always, I suspect this is an appropriate gospel for us to reflect as we gather in our time. Thank you for being with us, and hope to see you again.